Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel, and to part 2 of the Core Mechanics Guide series, where we're going to explore the pillars of Final Fantasy XIV's gameplay in depth. So today we are going to be talking about why macros on GCD skills are not actually effective and can actually really hinder your gameplay. Generally speaking, macros are something to shy away from in combat portions of Final Fantasy XIV, although they are definitely staple in all other activities ranging from glamour macros to crafting and gathering. But just in this video, we're just focused on combat macros. So in this video, we will be going over how macros can promote improper weaving and result in massive amounts of clipping, how macros can result in improper cooldown usage and timing, the inability to queue GCD skills on macros, and finally, how actions taken by macros are actually going to be, by default, including a little bit of delay. And technically, this delay can be so extensive that you might never actually be able to execute the later lines of a macro. So starting off, let's explain a little bit of this experiment that's playing on the screen right now, because people are probably like, what is going on here? So what we have here is one of these skills is going to be a macro, and the other one is going to not involve a macro. And so what we're having here is a bard spamming their baseline heavy shot ability. And for the record, it's going to be called burst shot, but just for ease of use, I'm just going to call it heavy shot throughout the rest of this video. And then the other one is going to involve the bard spamming a macro. And this macro is basically taking a whole whack of bard skills and putting them all together under one particular macro. And this macro is just going to try and unleash all of these skills as quickly as possible when they're available. And this macro choice, however, is very far from random. This is actually one of the prime suspects I see newer players use when they come and try and play the bard. And for those not familiar with the bard, a great proportion of their gameplay is actually based around special ability procs that ultimately are pretty random, if I'm being honest. But this isn't a bard video. I just want to explain that this macro here is actually very deliberately chosen, and talking more about the bard, best left for Bard Ultimate Guide. So our first point is that this can result in improper weaving and likewise result in clipping. If you came from the first video of this guide, you've been introduced to the notion that we can optimally weave in 2 off global cooldown abilities between 2 on global cooldown abilities during that default 2.5 second global cooldown window. But with a macro like this, we actually have ran into a very strange issue, where we have more than 2 global cooldown abilities on this macro being tried to push out at once. I actually mean off global cooldown abilities, for the record. So ultimately, with this macro, we have an absolutely ridiculous number of skills that are going to try and be rammed into the GCD window, and because of animation lock of some skills, this results in the GCD being pushed forward and ultimately shoving back the global cooldown timer, which is going to result in a net loss of DPS over time, as this pattern can repeat over and over and over during a fight. Not to mention that if your GCD is, say, at 2.4 seconds with 0.1 seconds waiting for the next 2.5 second GCD come up, that is going to result in the animation starting at 2.4 seconds, because that's when it just came up. And then that is going to have that animation lock pour right into the next global cooldown, completely pushing it, which ultimately is going to be very detrimental over the course of a 10-minute fight, where this seemingly minor loss of time actually multiplies each time it happens. So now let's talk about our second point, which is improper cooldown usage and timing. It is no secret at this point that if we use a macro like this, it becomes way harder to control exactly when we're using our abilities. During any rotation for any job in this game, it is actually very important to align cooldowns with when you're meant to actually use them in order to get optimal damage. Using cooldowns wildly can result in incredibly large dips in what you can actually put out. This isn't even getting into raid buff theory, taking this image from the Summoner Balance Discord, and likewise credits are on the image for the people who put this together, and thank you so much to them for this. But what we actually have here is that our raid DPS buffs are not actually going to align if we're not using them properly, and so this is going to be a net loss not only for ourselves, but for everyone else in our group as well. And so let's just take this a bit further and just focus on the Bard's opener, which is courtesy of the Balance Discord. And we can see that yes, we use Raging Strikes early on in the rotation, as well as the Dexterity Enhancing Potion, But if we use this macro, we would actually be missing out on core features such as using Sidewinder after the 6th global cooldown, or using Barrage after the 5th global cooldown, or Empyrean Arrow after the 2nd GCD when we actually have a song up. If you don't have a song up and you're using Empyrean Arrow, you're not actually using Empyrean Arrow, you're kind of throwing it in the garbage. And again, the details of that are best left to my Bard Ultimate Guide, but the loss of all of these core features does not result in just a small dip in DPS, but instead I can say in my own testing actually resulted in massively incredible DPS dips. The difference between using your cooldowns well and using them poorly is staggering to say the least. Now let's talk about how in Final Fantasy XIV you can queue skills. This basically means that when you press a skill button, the server is already informed of your next action that you want to take, and that you only really need to press a button once ever, and the server is going to execute that as soon as the next GCD slot is available for it. The problem with this, with macros, is that queue times are very important to preparing a skill to be executed smoothly after that last skill, immediately after that last skill. And so losing this means that instead of having a skill queued and ready to be launched automatically immediately after another skill, then now you actually need to send a novel button press after the global cooldown of the last skill, which does result in a minor delay, but again, we're talking about a multiplicative effect, and over a 10-minute fight, this is extremely apparent. But that delay from lack of queuing that we just mentioned is not the only delay that we are actually worried about. So macros inherently have a small delay tied to them, and as a disclaimer, this is not the same wait time delay that you'd encounter if you say wrote your macro to have a wait command in it. Like, take these crafter macros on the screen right now. This is not what we're talking about here. This is a very common misconception that even I myself used to have way back in the old days. This delay that we're talking about here is inherent to all macros like this, any macro like this, and it boils down to the fact that your macro is a script, and this script has multiple lines that must be executed. The trick is that the execution of each of these lines of the macro actually has a tiny delay involved in it based purely on your FPS. The exact equation for how much lag or delay is based on FPS is something I honestly couldn't even find myself, even with excessive digging. But let's say theoretically you lower your FPS to say 5 FPS. If you tried to mash this button for burst shot, this macro here, you would ultimately be at risk of literally never getting heavy shot off because it's way too low on that list. And so, kind of explaining why a bit more, is a macro starts at the top and tries to execute the first command, second, third, and so on down the list. But each time this macro is presented, it tries to execute it from the top to the bottom. So each time you press that macro, this ultimately boils down to if your macro is long enough and your FPS is low enough, you may theoretically never even execute the lower commands at all. But assuming that you can execute those commands, this inherent FPS-based list of top to bottom command execution means that you're going to be inserting this execution latency every single time you try and execute this macro. Ultimately, this also results in pushing back the GCD further and further off, and basically your numbers on your bar are going to be shoved off because of this. And ultimately that brings us to the end of this video. In general, macros are a very handy convenience tool and something that can help a lot of players. But overall, they are something that is generally discouraged, as macros unfortunately can and do lead to massive losses of efficiency and ultimately do hurt your gameplay significantly over time. Ultimately, it is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and that macros on GCDs are a combination of all of these factors. We're going to have promoting improper weaving, resulting in clipping, improper cooldown usage and timing, taking away your ability to queue GCD skills on macros, and the inherent default macro delay based on FPS. And all of this comes together full circle for combat macros. So thank you all for tuning into this video, I greatly appreciate it. And just leave a comment down below letting me know your thoughts. Have you ever encountered any of this? And we are before the 10-minute mark, so I'm going to cut it off here. Thank you so much and hope to see you in the next video. Have a great one.